6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm the Horticulture Educator in Extension Unit 13, so that's out of Champaign, Illinois. So I cover Champaign, Vermilion, Ford, and Iroquois counties. And so today we'll be discussing tree care in urban soils. Feel free to type in your questions in the sidebar as they come up, and I'll try and field those as we go along. I guess if there gets to be too many, maybe I'll wait till the end in the interest of getting through all my slides in time. But please feel free to type in, and at the end there'll be time for you guys to go ahead and unmute and ask questions verbally if you'd like to. So as far as an outline for tonight goes, I'm going to start by discussing soil formation in Illinois, not just central Illinois, but probably kind of could be generalized for the whole state, and then we'll look at the characteristics of urban soils in contrast to our undisturbed soils around the state. And then I'll move to a section where we'll look at what's wrong with my tree. So how can we diagnose some of these tree issues that relate back to soils problems? So we'll discuss abiotic stresses versus biotic stresses, and I'll define those a little later in our talk. And then after that, we'll move to some practical soil tests you can do to see if maybe you have a problem soil. And then finally, I'll discuss some of the current tree care practices that we can use to address soil issues that relate to trees. So this first slide shows glaciers, the glacial history of Illinois, which is really important when we consider soil formation, because our soils across the state, if you look at figure C here, at one point the entire state of Illinois was covered by glaciers, almost. The southern tip didn't quite get it, but the point is that glaciers had a major impact on the landscape in Illinois, and you have to, and it took many thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years for all of this process to unfold that created the soils that we have now today. So it always was really hard for me to picture a glacier, but it's a giant sheet of ice, so it's hundreds of feet thick at times, and it basically grinds across the landscape in Illinois and really takes things almost all the way down to bedrock. And in this next slide, there's a figure here at the right that kind of shows a glacier. And let me see if I can switch to my laser pointer thing. So this figure over here has a detail of a glacier. So you can see this giant sheet of ice here is grinding nearly down to the bedrock, and it's picking up a lot of material. So that material that it picks up we call glacial till. So a till plane, so anyway, I have a few of the different glacial features here at the left that I'm going to kind of define for you guys. And the reason why we want to understand this or know about these is it helps to understand, it helps you to interpret the soils that are at the site that you're assessing. If you know that you're on one of these glacial features, you'll have different soils than if you're not. So a till plane occurs when a large sheet of this glacier breaks off and melts, and so you have a pretty uniform flat plane that's created, and all that till drops out of the ice and accumulates, and that's what creates the parent materials in those areas. An outwash plane is indicated here, and that's where the flow, as the glacier melts, the flow kind of concentrates into a flow path and flows out and creates a plane of this outwash. So all the soils in that area would be kind of similar there. Ground moraines are kind of the gently rolling hills you see. As you get into southern Illinois, you see a lot more of these, where the glaciers kind of didn't have as much of an impact, and towards the tail end of glaciation in Illinois, you see a lot of these ground moraines, gently rolling hills. And then finally, in moraines are kind of where a glacier stops, it melts, and it just drops out a big pile of stuff. And in central Illinois, where I'm at, those are very prominent features in the landscape. You can really, once you start to notice those, you can really tell you're at an in-moraine, and you know that the soils in that in-moraine are going to be different than soils in other areas. So when I originally wrote this talk, I did it for Vermilion County, one of our counties here, so I kind of assessed Vermilion County soils for this, but the start of this slide really summarizes soil formation. Again, it takes thousands of years for this to happen. I've heard soil scientists say that it takes about 1,000 years for an inch of topsoil to form, so that's really significant time scale. But to really summarize these thousands of years, the glacial activity in Illinois drastically influenced the topography. It tended to flatten things. That topography influenced plant development, and then and then plant development, along with many other factors, influenced our soils over time. So some of those other factors are, well, time is one, the climate, what parent material was there. So in our case, a lot of the parent material is this glacial material. What kind of topography was there, and then the organisms that had an impact are also other factors. So not only plants, but some of the microbiology that occurs in the soil also influences that. So when we look at Vermilion County soils as a whole, about 70% of those soils are mollisols, or prairie soils, and only about 20% of those are forest soils. And that's pretty typical of a central Illinois county, and I would say maybe some of them are even a little lower in forest soils, maybe a little lower than that 20% mark. But all of this information that I just shared with you actually came from the Vermilion County Soil Survey, and you can see a picture of the hard copy of it here on the right. But all of that data is also available on Web Soil Survey. It's a really great service that USDA provides, where it has an interactive map. You can find your home or your location that you're looking at, and it'll show you how USDA has mapped the soils there. So it'll have a description of your soil. It'll tell you if it's a mollisol or an alpha sol, and it'll tell you how deep to groundwater, and a lot of other really important information can very easily and quickly be gathered on Web Soil Survey. So here I have two soil profiles, and these are taken actually from a soil pit. And if you've never had a chance to get down in a soil pit, I strongly suggest you do. It really changes the way you can look at this, and especially if you can get in a soil pit with a soil scientist. I went to a couple Midwest forest soils conferences that they hold around Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, around there. If you can really get in a pit with a soil scientist, they'll tell you more about this than you could ever want to know, but there's a lot of things that we can't observe with a hand-dug pit that you can see in these soil profiles. So one of these soils is a forest soil, and one of these soils is a prairie soil. And I wonder would anybody out there have any kind of guess as to which is which? When I flip the slide here, we'll see that the darker soil on the left is drummer silty clay loam, which is a prairie soil, and the lighter soil on the right is Fayette silt loam, which is an alpha sol, or a forest soil. So we can see a big difference just in color, and really the much darker color of the prairie soil is due to the higher organic matter content, and the lighter color of the forest soil is just that it doesn't have as much organic matter. And now this thing I just pulled up shows the different soil horizons. If you've ever studied soils or taken a soil class or spent much time around them, you probably have heard of soil horizons. And the big thing to look at here is that there's quite a difference between these two soils in the relative thickness of the horizons and how they're laid out as the profile goes down into the ground. So the A horizon is typically characterized by a much higher organic matter. This is what we often call topsoil. It's also the zone of biological activity. That's where most biological activity, so nutrient cycling by microbes, nutrient uptake by roots, plant growth, all that stuff happens up in the A horizon, really important area of soil. As we move down, we get to the B horizon, which has lower organic matter and a different composition than the A horizon. That's how we can delineate the horizons. There's a difference in texture. Texture is the composition of sand, silt, and clay in the soil, so there's a much different texture down there. And it's also known as the zone of accumulations. Things from the upper soil profiles are able to move down and accumulate into that B horizon. So, and due to that fact that things move downward in the soil, clay often moves down and accumulates in that B horizon a little more. So drainage in the B horizon is much different. Water and air movement in the B horizon is much different than the A horizon. So this slide shows an urban soil, and there's quite a bit of material here of what we're calling human artifacts, so it's a little bit out of the ordinary that you see quite this much stuff in it, but I wanted to throw this up as an example of an urban soil that can have a lot of stuff even mixed down into the C horizon in this case. Here's an urban soil that's a lot more characteristic of what we see in central Illinois. If you look here, this layer on top obviously is something different than the rest of the soil. You can see from the drastic color change. And so probably what's happened here is somewhere near this soil pit that we're looking at, there was a hole dug, either for a foundation for a home or something else that have some excavation done, and they took all that soil from the hole, which is probably B and sometimes even C horizon soil, so way down in that profile, and they spread it out and graded it out over the yard at the end. And so you can see where the old, this possibly could have been the old ground line, or they could have stripped some topsoil and replaced it with all this B and C horizon stuff. So what's happened effectively to this soil is you have a barrier right here to water and air movement. It's usually highly compacted because it was graded out with machinery that drove over it, and so it really changes water and air movement down through the soil. And so this is pretty characteristic of a lot of newer neighborhoods and urban areas. You see this a lot, and you can really tell right away when you start to dig a hole, especially in central Illinois, where you should be seeing that really dark, rich, black soil, but you get this jumbled up mixture of B and C horizons. So you usually know pretty quick when you have an urban soil, it has those impacts. So what are some of the main impacts to urban soils? Well, we tend to add a lot of impervious surfaces. So that's roads, driveways, the roof of your house, lots of places where water is not allowed to infiltrate into that soil profile like it naturally would, and therefore it runs off quickly and it goes to different places, or that water and gas can't even reach the soil profile because it's covered by concrete or something. So that's a big impact that changes the urban landscape. But probably one of the biggest impacts is compaction. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but compaction is just squishing those soil particles together. You're reducing the ability for water and air to move through the soil and changing a lot of things. As we talked about with the displacement of the topsoil and the upper horizon of this urban soil we see on the right here, grading and clearing and excavating are a lot of things that happen in the urban environment and affect our soils. And then finally, as we saw the first urban soil, we looked at inclusion of foreign materials, so that can a lot of construction materials and other things can be buried, and that can actually impact a lot of soil properties as well. So soil compaction is one of the major biggest impacts to urban soils, and I think one of the points I'd like you guys to understand and walk away from this with is that although heavy equipment can cause compaction, your typical urban soil is compacted just from foot traffic or from us mowing our yards and continually driving around in the same areas. So just foot traffic or a mower can really cause this compaction, and if you're trying to do things to avoid causing soil compaction, not being on the soil when it's wet, it can really help, because when the soil's wetter, we're going to squish it down more. So as soil gets compacted and the air spaces you see in this diagram get squeezed out, what it does is reduces the oxygen available to roots. And believe it or not, roots actually need oxygen to do their all the physiological functions they provide trees. Then on top of that, it makes that soil denser and more difficult for roots to penetrate and grow out into. So that tends to reduce health, tree health, extend transplant shock, do a lot of things that negatively impact our trees, and it increases these biotic stresses, which I'll talk about a little later. So important to understand that soil compaction is a major impact. So pH is another thing that can be impacted in urban soils. And I know from experience that these urban soils can be very unpredictable and variable across just a small yard. You could dig a soil pit 20 yards from another one and find entirely different soils there. Now, there are natural variabilities in undisturbed soils, but it's important to understand that in an urban soil, you just never know. So you really, if you're going to do soil sampling or any of these tests that we talk about, it really needs to be done right in the spot you're going to plant the tree or you're going to do the project, because just a few yards away can be something entirely different. But as soil pH gets impacted, it can have an effect on the way plants uptake nutrients. And this chart here at the right shows the pH across the top. So here's more basic and here is more acidic. And then each one of these little bars represents a soil nutrient or element. And the wider the bar is, the more readily available it is to the plant at that pH. So nitrogen, as you can see, it's a very important plant nutrient. It's available across a wide range of the pH scale. One element I like to point out in particular is iron, and if you take a look at it, as we get more acidic, it gets wider and bigger, indicating that plants can uptake it better in a more acidic soil. So we often see in central Illinois chlorosis on pin oaks and river birch are a couple that I see that on a lot. And that's not because iron is missing. It's an iron deficiency that you're seeing as the symptom in the leaves and what the tree's showing you, but it's not because iron isn't there. It's because iron's not available to the plant due to the pH of the soil. So that's actually a relatively easy fix out of the problems that we'll talk about today, and that you can acidify the soil and it makes the iron available to the plant, and then the tree's symptoms subside. Turf grass is another major impact to our urban soils. We love to have turf everywhere in the urban landscape, and turf certainly has its place. It holds the world together. It stops erosion. It does a lot of good things for us, but trees and turf often fight with each other. A tree casts shade over the turf, which needs full sun to develop. We all know that from the large shade tree in our yard we can never get grass to grow under. But in turn, the turf has a very dense root system. If you look here in that upper 6 inches of soil, there is a lot of turf roots, and that's what this plant was put here to do, form a dense mat of roots that hold soil together and lets us walk and mow and do all those things that we want to do in our yard on top of it. But when we get just a smaller half-inch rain in the summertime, oftentimes that grass root system absorbs all that water before the tree can even get any. So they really, trees and turf really fight with each other. And so that environment that a monotype of turf creates in your yard with that very symmetrical 6-inch deep, super thick fibrous root system impacts soil fauna. So a lot of the soil microbial activity that we see in the forest, in an undisturbed forest soil, is not present in the urban environment due to the changes, all the changes. So one of the best solutions to eliminate turf is mulch, and we'll talk about mulch in a little bit later here too. So now let's talk about what's wrong with my tree. How can we diagnose some of these issues? So the diagnosis of tree disorders really starts with IDing your tree. So you really, most times, need to identify down to species. And what that does is allows you to then go research and find the common problems associated with that species and start checking off the list which ones you may or may not have. Observing tree symptoms is the next step, and that's something we can all do, and observing those symptoms over time to understand the pattern is also very important. Doing your homework is the other factor that we can kind of add in. So all that history, the transplant history, what's the climate or weather been like? Do you know anything about impacts to the environment? Has there been construction lately? Has there been any reason why those soils would be impacted? What type of maintenance practices, fertilization, irrigation, other things, what kind of things have we done? So to put all that together and figure out what kind of problem you have with your tree is often compared to a detective solving a mystery. And I really like this, the International Society of Arboriculture puts out this Detective Dendro series that I'm not sure if it still is, but it used to be an article in their magazines that they sent out, Arborist News. But really interesting little spin on it. It's a detective type character that's solving a mystery and takes all the clues about the tree and finds it out. But it's become so popular they've actually made it into a podcast, so that's a really fun one you can listen to. And they really have an interesting scientific spin on how to diagnose things, and it's another way to kind of hone your skills at this. But now let's talk about this concept of an abiotic stress versus a biotic stress. So an abiotic stress is something caused by the environment, so soil compaction, a lightning strike, lots of things like that, whereas a biotic stress is caused by some type of living organism, whether it's a pathogen or an insect or maybe a nematode in the soil. So there's a big difference between these when you start generalizing how the symptoms come about. And I'm saying we're definitely generalizing here. There's always exceptions to the rule, but in trying to kind of go with the odds of what these things mean, you can kind of generalize and categorize them. That in the case of an abiotic stress, you're probably going to have several species impacted of various ages, as opposed to a biotic stress where it's just one species, oftentimes of the same age. And that's because that pathogen that's impacting the tree has very specific host requirements. So it may just be one species or one age of tree, whereas in abiotic stress like weather, it can affect any age tree and any size and any species. So along with that, an abiotic stress has a pretty uniform pattern. Oftentimes, like the slide says, one side of the tree or the lower part of the tree shows symptoms, whereas a biotic stress may be a more random or irregular pattern throughout the tree canopy. Obviously, with an abiotic stress, you don't have evidence of the pest or pathogen, but with a biotic, you probably can find the insects or maybe some of the evidence of fungal growth or something, some clue that the pathogen's there. And finally, probably another very good point to understand is the fact that a biotic stress that's infectious will spread over time, whereas an abiotic stress is typically caused by one thing that happens once and it doesn't increase or get worse or spread all that much. So what are some of the symptoms that trees show us if they're having soil issues? Well, if you read down this list, it's a lot of things that are very similar to other conditions that a tree can have. So I would say out of this list, the ones that probably stick out to me the most are unusually small leaves and really low annual twig growth. Those are a couple that that shows that a tree is really stressed. It's struggling. It's struggling to get the twig growth it needs every year to expand its canopy and get more leaf area and support that big root system that it needs. So, and a lot of times that relates to a soil issue. No trunk flare is often the sign of a soils problem, and this bald cypress you see here has a beautiful trunk flare, one of the best trees for trunk flares I know of. Whereas this Norway maple looks like a telephone pole going into the ground, so it doesn't have much of a buttress flare on the trunk, indicating it could have a girdling root or other problems, and I'll talk about those a little bit later too. And another common symptom of a soil problem is that another pathogen becomes a problem. In the case of this Norway maple, I'm pretty sure it's actually been cut down now, but I'm pretty sure that tree had verticillium wilt. And if you could see off the camera out this way, there's 3 other Norway maples in a line that have no problems, have a trunk flare, and don't have verticillium wilt. So verticillium wilt is soil-borne. And oftentimes the stress of a girdling root or soil stress on a tree can cause it to become susceptible to that pathogen, whereas maybe those couple other Norway maples are doing a little better and aren't quite as susceptible. So now let's talk about some soil tests that you can do at home to see if you may have a problem soil. The first one is just to dig a soil pit, and that's usually where I start if I'm planting a tree, if I'm setting up a new garden bed, whatever it is, I dig a hole just to see what I've got down there. So you can look for the presence of soil horizons. You can look to see if you have this, jumbled up mixture of subsoil right here, or if you have what looks to be undisturbed soil horizons. It may seem pretty obvious, but looking for roots as you dig, like the presence of roots are a sign that something good is going on down there. Foreign objects, seems obvious you'd find that. I guess at a house I used to live at in southern Illinois, we were going to move the garden and put it in the front yard to get it away from all the deer pressure out in the back part of the property. And thankfully, I dug a soil pit there before I got the neighbor's tiller, and I found out that there was an old house right there that had been torn down and buried in a big hole. So not a good spot for your garden. Probably has some foreign materials down there, could be impacting pH or other things. So finally, something else you can observe is just the structure of the soil. Is it a homogeneous seeming material, or does it crumble into PEDs or individual little structures? If it still has some of its structure intact, it's going to break off into a different pattern of PEDs based on what kind of soil it is. So that's one indication, if it's breaking off into clumps, that you maybe still have some of your soil structure, because when we dig up that subsoil and spread it around and let rain get on it and drive equipment over it, we essentially destroy all of that structure that the soil would have had from those hundreds of thousands of years of formation many tens of thousands of years of formation that our soils experienced. And that's just irreplaceable. That's one thing that we can't replace. So if you look down here, there's a little diagram of the soil ribbon test, and that's a really good one to identify clay content, is what it tells us. So if you had a high clay content in this area up here, that might be contributing to a drainage problem, or that might be some of the reason why that your tree roots aren't able to get out into that compacted soil. But to do a soil ribbon test, you take a little ball of soil and you get it wet and roll it around your hand, and you don't want it so sticky and gooey that it won't stay in a ball, but you want it plenty wet so it gets into the ball, and then you're going to squeeze that soil between your finger and thumb and start to make a ribbon. And if you get greater than 2 inches, where in our little diagram here, that's a pretty good ribbon there. That's probably 3 inches or more. You have lots of clay. So that's just a really general way to do it. There's soil scientists use this in a much more scientific way, but for our cases, know that greater than 2 inches, you probably have a lot of clay there. This is a do-it-yourself version of a soil percolation test, and that's what a soil scientist would do to assess your soil properties for installation of a leach field or some other construction type activities that they may need to know drainage for. So essentially what you're going to do with this is dig a hole about a foot around, or whatever is easy to dig with your round point shovel or whatever you use, and about 18 inches deep. That's about the depth that tree roots go down to. So we're kind of digging a soil pit that mimics the depth of tree roots and the rooting zone of trees. You'll fill the hole with water and let it sit overnight. So you may have to actually top it off a few times. If you have plenty of time to sit there and kind of watch it and do other yard work while it's going on, make sure get it good and topped off and full, and then let it sit overnight and soak in all that water. And the idea is that we want it in as close to saturated conditions as we can, because if it's not saturated, we don't know where it falls on the gradient between saturated and unsaturated, so we want to get it as wet as possible. And then that next day, you would fill the hole again to the brim. The totally saturated soil profile is there, and you'd fill it up again, and then you would measure the drainage and how many inches per hour that drainage goes down. And so if you get 3 inches or more per hour, that's very good. Less than an inch, you have really poor drainage. And I mean, I've been really surprised at how many of these holes in a neighborhood with that jumbled up subsoil on the surface really doesn't even drain an inch per hour once it's saturated. And that's a good sign that that might be causing some impacts to your tree. Another thing you can do is submit a soil sample to a lab for testing, and this really tells you a lot of information. They're going to give you organic matter content of your soil, the nutrient content. They can even do micronutrients, which are pretty important to fruit trees and a lot of our shade trees. So that is something that maybe for a little additional cost, they usually charge a little more for that, you can get the test. But relatively inexpensive, probably around $20 a test, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. But for the information you get, it's really invaluable. It's really worth the cost. But I always encourage folks, after you get your test results back and you're trying to interpret those, typically these labs send you a nice little report that has an interpretation of your results. But as you're trying to understand those or digest those, please don't hesitate to call the lab that you took the test from, because they always have an agronomist on staff that can answer these questions, and that's part of the service they're providing you from their soil test fee, is some of this follow-up and explanation of what they found. And another thing is I would probably contact them before actually collecting the soil samples. They may have a way they want you to collect those or get them to you. U of I Extension maintains a list of soil testing labs that you can see at the right here, and there's the website, the web address. You can usually mail samples into these labs, so don't think that if a lab's not near you, you can't get a test, because they'll accept the samples through the mail. So now let's look at some of the solutions to soil issues. So many of these problems are difficult to correct. As we talked about, soil formation takes thousands of years. So we're often looking at a situation where we're going to mitigate the problem as opposed to totally correct it, because we can't mimic 10,000 years worth of soil formation. So again, it helps to start by doing your homework, collecting the data that you can. You're observing plant symptoms, maybe some soil tests. It always helps to have good references. I really like this extension site for selecting trees for your home. If you go to search by trees here, once you've identified your tree down to species, you can search by species, and it'll show you some common problems. So right away you can look at 4 or 5 of the most common problems and either say, yeah, we might have that or we might not have that. And that can help you eliminate some of the pathogens that might not be soil related to know if you really have a soil issue. And if in the end, if you're not able to do it or you're not able to identify the tree, don't hesitate to hire a professional. The International Society of Arboriculture maintains a certified arborist credential, and on their Trees Are Good website, they have a locator where you can find arborists near you, or they actually have a lot of really great informational material that has great info about trees that's free for you to download and check out. So mulching is one of the best solutions to a lot of these problems. And I know it sounds like a really simple one, but it really is one of the only long-term solutions to soil problems. Now, it's a very long-term solution. As we talked about, it takes a lot of time for soil formation to happen. But what happens when you apply mulch is, first of all, you've removed the turf that may have otherwise been there, and you've created an environment for soil microbial activity and everything else that happens right there at the interface, at the soil surface, that's much similar to an undisturbed forest environment that trees evolved in and obviously do much better in than our urban environments. So that's the main reason why we want to apply mulch. But on top of that, there's a lot of other benefits: preserving moisture, slowly adding the nutrients back into the soil, because that mulch is a big carbon source for all the microbial activity that cycles nutrients in the soil. But over time, it improves a lot of things, including aeration, soil structure, like we talked about, is really hard to repair, and drainage and biology. It impacts the soil microbial population that's there in a positive way. So if you're going to apply mulch, I typically apply it pretty thick, just because it's probably going to settle out to about half the depth that you first put it on at. So if you only put on about 3 inches, it's probably going to shrink down to about 1.5 inches, and that's not a lot of mulch, and may require a reapplication the next year. So I recommend applying 6 to 8 inches deep, and extending out to the drip line of the tree if possible. I really love this picture because I think it's of a golf course, but they've mulched way out to the edge of the drip line of this tree, and there's not much of a better thing you can do than mulch all the way out to the drip line. I definitely understand the fact that in the urban environment, space is limited, and a giant mulch bed that size is difficult to maintain. But if you can, you just have to strike a balance. How far out can we stand a mulch, and how much space do we have? But I recommend using aged mulch. The fresh mulch right off the chip truck can actually have some impacts to maybe not the soil, but some of the more sensitive plants you may have in your bed under the tree. So if you let it age if you get a pile of the fresh mulch, if you let it age for about a year, then you don't have to worry about that. But I will say that fresh mulch, or the whole tree mulch that comes off the chipper truck, is probably the best product you can use for mulch, because it has all those ingredients like twigs and bark, leaves, and all that stuff's in there that you would normally have in the forest, and it really mimics that natural environment. And I think you've probably all heard about the mulch volcanoes. Keep the mulch pulled away from the trunk tissue. We're going to talk about the importance of keeping that area of the trunk that meets the ground healthy in a couple slides here, but certainly we'd never want to pile mulch along the tree. So to take mulching to another level, there's a practice called vertical mulching. And what we're going to do in this treatment is drill holes. And this is a top view of the tree, and these are holes about every 3 feet apart is what they're supposed to illustrate. With this side view, you can see those holes go down about 18 inches and cover the main rooting zone of the tree. And so after we've drilled all those holes, we're going to come back and backfill those holes with amended soil. So I would have a cordless drill with a 6-inch auger on it that I was drilling those holes with. And then right next to me would be a big wheelbarrow of mixed up amended soil. So I usually added about 1/3 compost, and then I added some beneficial soil biota, which we'll talk about in another slide, but some of those microbes that are active in the soil in the forest that maybe because of turf or disturbed soil or other reasons they aren't present in the urban environment. So this is a great practice. It really helps I've really seen it do a lot for large, mature trees that are showing signs of decline. It's one of the most beneficial practices I've seen that's started to slow down that decline of large, mature shade trees. But on that same note, this is also a very labor-intensive practice. It takes a lot of work. It's going to take an afternoon of hole digging and refilling with amended soil to accomplish this under the entire drip line of a tree. So what are some of those soil amendments or the soil biota we can add back? Well, one of the big ones is mycorrhizae, and if you haven't heard of those, they're a beneficial fungus that infects tree roots, and it helps those trees take up water and nutrients better, and in exchange the tree helps the fungus. It's a symbiotic relationship between the fungus and trees, so good for both sides. And then we can also add beneficial bacteria, which aid in nutrient cycling. They're the soil biota that fuels that nutrient cycling and the return of nutrients to the soil that are plant available. And these products also include what they call biostimulants, which are things like sea kelp and yucca that they just promote they're just fuel for all the other microbes to do the things that they like to do. So that, as far as application methods go, we've already talked about the vertical mulching, but the practice you see here is called radial trenching, and so they've actually used a compressed air tool called an air spade to blow away all the soil around here, and it's a really unique process in that that compressed air, and it's really high PSI air coming out of there, blows away all the soil, but it leaves these roots. And if you can see on this slide, it's a bunch of those really fibrous, massive roots are still left here, and the soil's gone. So that's great. Now we can replace all this soil that we've removed with amended soil with these things added to it. And as a final way you can add it, you can add it through liquid injection. And here's actually the product that I've used the most. It has mycorrhizae, beneficial bacteria, and biostimulants all in it. It's a powder. And so you can take this powder and either mix it into your wheelbarrow to make the fill that you want to put back in, or you can pour it into water, and you need a sprayer and and a compressor to shoot that into the soil. And so under high pressure, you can shoot it into the soil and add it that way as well. So it's pretty quick and easy way to get some soil microbes into your soil. So the root collar we've kind of talked about. It's this basal flare of a tree. It's where the tree flares out, and that transition happens between trunk tissue and root tissue. And we found out that it's a really important part of the tree. There's a lot of processes that happen there, and there's actually photosynthetic cells that do photosynthesis. There's a lot of gas exchange that happens there. So when we pile mulch up there, or if we plant a tree too deep and add too much soil up over the trunk, then it really impacts tree health. And I think I've probably seen it most on young trees that are planted a little too deeply is where we have some of these issues. And I think probably some of the reason why you don't see it on older trees is because they don't make it that long. This is a picture of that Norway maple we saw earlier, and you can see it goes straight into the ground like a telephone pole. There's very little actual trunk flare on this one. And after removing the tree, cutting it down and getting it out of there, I did find there's a girdling root right around here, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But that's probably why this tree had suffered so much. But anyway, it's pretty easy to identify whether you have a root collar or not. This tree obviously has none. The bald cypress has one, and for a white pine, this is actually not a bad root flare. They're not going to have as much as a bald cypress, and so you have to understand that different species have different amounts of root flare, or different character on their root flare. So these root collar disorders we're talking about, they occur when the root collar is buried or not present in the soil. So it's probably not present in the soil because it's buried. And since soil is up against the trunk, it promotes root growth in that area. And especially when plants like this come from a ball and burlapped or containerized situation, they can already have roots that are kind of circling within the pot. And then when you plant that tree too deep, you allow soil up along the trunk where those roots can develop more. And pretty soon, they're touching the trunk and compressing some of that conductive tissue. It's most identifiable by the absence of a root collar. Some of the symptoms are yellow foliage, reduced twig growth, smaller leaves, early fall color. And this picture is an example of this red maple in mid-September was in full fall color, where every other red maple in this line along the street was not. And so I had to take a picture, being the tree guy that I am. And when I did get out and inspected the trunk there, sure enough, there was a root collar disorder, but it was caused by a mower. About half of the 3/4 of the stem was rubbed off by a mower or a string trimmer or something that hit it. So anyway, those are. It's really important to keep that area, the root collar, at the soil surface. So what do we do when we found that problem? Well, we do what's called a root collar excavation, and by doing that, we're going to remove some of this soil that's piled up. In this case, it looks kind of like mulch. It's just mulch here, but we're going to try and remove all that material and get down to the basal flare or the root collar. Here's actually a picture of an air spade in action. So you can see all that fibrous, dense matter roots that's left, and it's blown away all the soil. And literally in minutes, you can do one of these excavations that otherwise with a hand trowel, you have to kind of dig so carefully around the trunk and other things that it takes a significantly longer amount of time to actually do it by hand. But I've done a ton of these over the years by hand. It certainly is. It's pretty easy to do, especially on a younger tree you're getting ready to plant or something. This older tree had construction fill and damage. This is all newer fill. You can kind of tell the grass is a little thinner and more wispy. But all that, so it was, you could see the fill went up to about here, and so they've removed all that and exposed the trunk flare, and that tree should do much better now that it doesn't have soil up there. So girdling roots are one of the side effects of many of these root collar disorders. It's a root that encircles the trunk like this one you see here and compresses the conductive tissue for the tree. So the veins of the tree are just right inside the bark there, and when you have a root pressing up against it, it compresses that area and essentially cuts off a portion of the root zone for that tree. So when a tree gets to be about the size of this is another Norway maple. They're somewhat prone to this. Gets to this size and has a girdling root around it like that, it's probably going to be fatal to the tree eventually. It's just going to slowly decline until that tree probably dies from that. But one thing we do know, as arborists have studied this, that we know that certain trees are much more prone to girdling roots than others. Here's kind of a short list of those. So as you're trying to assess these problems, you can first reference and see whether your tree is on the list of those that are very prone. But I'd say maple and Colorado blue spruce, red maple, those are a couple, boy, of the most. White pine's probably another one that's pretty prone to it. But you just know from looking at enough of these that those trees are certainly prone to these type of orders. So what's the treatment? Well, we're going to start with a root collar excavation. So we're going to dig down and see how many girdling roots we have and what we can do about them. And the rule of thumb on that is really, if it's much larger than your thumb, you probably really want to strongly consider whether the tree can handle you cutting that root. And I guess I always kind of take the whole entire picture of tree health into consideration when I have a girdling root that's a little bigger than my thumb that I'm thinking about cutting. Sometimes you can justify going a little bigger than that, just thinking if I don't do this, like in the case of this tree that's pictured here, if that girdling root isn't cut, that's going to probably kill the tree. So although that's probably a little bit bigger than the arborist's thumb in this picture, it's probably a good idea that he or she go ahead and cut that and get it out of there, and hopefully the tree can recover. So as far as assessing how serious of a problem this is, if it is compressing more than 1/3 of the stem of the tree, that's probably when I'm starting to consider removal, or just understanding that this tree really doesn't have a great future, and it's, it may live for another 5 years, but that's ultimately what's going to cause it to die. And so this is one of my last slides, and it's a really nice one about tree planting that a group of master gardeners up in Wisconsin and Outagamie County, Wisconsin, put together. It was in one of their newsletters I saw on the internet. But But one of the things I like about it is it has a nice wide, shallow hole. So, well, actually, to move through the steps, the first step in any tree planting operation is to identify the root collar. So dig down into this. It looks like this root collar is right at the surface, but you would dig down into the ball or burlap to the container, try and find the root flare, and then you want to plant your tree right at the height of that root flare. So that's going to determine the depth of your hole right away once you do that root collar. Secondly, you're going to dig a broad and shallow hole. The wider out you can dig this hole, the better. I would probably dig it as wide as I could stand. And you don't have to loosen down as deep as the ball. If you can just get the top 12 inches all through here loosened up, then that creates a nice loosened aerated area for those tree roots to develop out into, and it gives them a chance. You know, any of that material from the ball and burlap, we're going to want to remove. And I realize that in larger trees, they often have a wire basket. You don't have to get every last piece of it, but you need to get it down below the 12-inch or so range where most of your roots are going to be. So it's not going to impact our roots later. And you can cut it and just bend it back down into the hole. All that burlap needs to come off. A lot of times there's ropes circling the tree trunk. Pull that off. So all that material is going to come back off. You're going to plant the tree at the proper height based on the root collar, and then we're going to backfill the hole with amended soil. I typically always use some type of soil amendment. My thinking behind that is if I'm going to dig out all this soil for that hole, I might as well add some compost and some good stuff before I throw it back in. And I'm usually adding mycorrhizae and all that soil biota, that powdered product, into the fill as well as I fill it back around the ball. And watering of your tree and follow-up care are just absolutely critical. So that as soon as I get a tree planted and all that fill back in, the first thing I'm doing is getting a hose and watering that in. And I've found that probably the best way to water a tree in is just a garden hose on a trickle. So it's not running fast enough that it's going to cause erosion or soil to move out of the area, but it's trickling, and so it's probably going to take a couple hours to water that tree, or maybe all afternoon, but that's what I found is the best way to just get that whole area watered. And then, as you know, the slide says here, follow-up care is critical for that first 2 to 3 years after planting. A tree technically is still in transplant shock. So you have to understand that and just know, at least for the next couple years, during that hot, dry part of the year, we're probably going to need to water the tree. We want to keep it well mulched and just baby it along to set it up for a great life over the long run. So in conclusion, many of these soil problems are very difficult to identify, and there's not a lot of easy ways to fix them. Commonly, as an arborist, I would recommend some of the basic plant health care practices to address these issues. That's like mulching, watering, a lot of these things. So anything we can do to kind of take the edge off the urban environment is something that's obviously going to help. You know, the methods that we have for soil amendment are there, but they're a bit complicated or involved to do, so sometimes they aren't practical on a larger scale. But the one thing that we can always remember is that proper tree planting and establishing your trees correctly can really help with that issue, a lot of these problems ahead of time, so you don't have to deal with them down the road. And so if you guys ever want to listen to any of our past recordings, we have a YouTube site. This presentation will actually be up probably in the next week or so on our YouTube site. And I also want to remind you guys that we have one more of the Winter Four Seasons presentations coming up with Chris Enroth. I think he'll be talking about, he's another extension horticulture educator. He'll be talking about season extension, so watch for that one. And then our spring series, I think registration for the spring series happens or opens up tomorrow, I believe. And so here's my contact info. I do see a couple questions here. I'll take a look at those in a sec, but if anybody wants to ever call or email me with any follow-up questions about this, feel free. There's my info. And let me take a look here. It looks like David had a question. Does the age of my urban soil have an impact? My neighborhood is over 100 years old, and I'm wondering, since it was excavated without heavy machinery, if it would make a difference in texture and compaction. Well, knowing that your neighborhood has had 100 years of age, David, it probably has a lot of compaction and human impact. So I don't know. I'd say one thing that's maybe on your side for the fact that it's an older neighborhood is that we just didn't have as big and impactful of equipment back then. So we couldn't do as much in a day. We couldn't move as much soil. And so I think probably some of the worst urban soils I've seen are in newer neighborhoods around Champaign-Urbana that are where they're expanding out into cornfields that in urban sprawl, and I think that's probably some of the worst ones. It seems like nowadays we're much better at impacting those urban soils than we used to be. The time as an urban soil probably does have an impact. As we talked about, a lot of that soil biota that's present in the forest winds up missing in the urban setting. So the longer of an urban influence we have on that soil, we can probably generalize that, like, the less of that natural, naturally occurring soil biota would be there. So let's see. So there's another question here. Poorly performing trees that have just been planted. Is there a rule of thumb for transplant shock versus having a planting problem? A lot of homeowners assume immediately that the tree has been inappropriately treated, but that seems like a jump to a conclusion that might not be correct. There's not necessarily a rule of thumb for how long transplant shock lasts. Actually, some trees that are planted in really poor urban soils never come out of transplant shock. They ultimately die from it. So just like we talked about, root development can be hampered in a highly compacted soil. A lot of these younger trees that I saw that were really suffering or died in the urban setting, I could never find a root outside of that original hole that was dug. So, that's another case for digging as wide of a hole as you can, because it's just that all the soil around it that wasn't loosened is like concrete. And another thing that can happen is as we, every place that we dig and have the edge of the pit of the transplant hole, that's changed that interface right there, and there can actually be clogging of pores and other things that happens right on the edge of the place that we're digging. So that's something to think about too. But yeah, I wouldn't say there's really a rule of thumb for transplant shock. I usually tell people 2 to 3 years. I think I've seen in the literature where they try and relate the diameter of the trunk to years of transplant shock, and I think the assumption there is the bigger the tree, the longer the transplant shock. So I think that's probably a pretty safe rule of thumb. You can assume that if you're planting a large balled and burlap tree, you maybe need to plan on 3 or 4 years or maybe even 5 of transplant shock. But given a lot of the things we talked about, digging a nice wide hole, amending soil that you put back in, mulching, maintaining that mulch ring around your tree, not up against the trunk, keeping the root collar right at the soil surface, a lot of those things put together are going to work to minimize transplant shock. So, any other questions? I think you guys can unmute yourselves and talk if you needed to as well. Give it another minute here if anybody wants to type one in. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm always excited to talk about trees. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. So anyway, as you can see, my contact info is up here. Feel free to look me up if you have some tree questions. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again for another Four Seasons webinar sometime. Thank you.